We often ignore the quiet, insidious friction of raw ambition colliding with silent desperation. When a deeply fractured human ego seeks external validation, the mind effortlessly justifies crossing boundaries that were once considered sacred. In the quiet, sunlit streets of Meridian, Idaho, nestled safely at the foot of the majestic Rockies, the delicate illusion of suburban perfection was carefully maintained. Rob and Candy Hall seemed to have engineered a flawless life. They had been married for more than 15 years. They shared 2 teenage daughters and a beautiful home far removed from their former stressful life in California. Rob was a steady, highly dependable computer technician working for the local sheriff's department. He was the unquestioned anchor. Candy was a 40-year-old paralegal searching endlessly for her rightful place, desperate to prove her intellectual worth after agonizingly losing her previous job. But a steady anchor cannot hold a restless ship that secretly yearns to drift into dark waters. Enter Emmett Corrigan. He was a 30-year-old legal prodigy, notoriously cocky, boyishly handsome, and undeniably ambitious. He was a man who seemingly possessed everything: a thriving new private law practice, a beautiful wife named Ashley, and 5 children waiting for him in a devoted marriage. He was meant to be Candy's professional mentor and new boss. Instead, the blinding, toxic gravity of their mutual attraction would aggressively drag 2 innocent families into a fatal vortex. Their disastrous collision course would ultimately end on cold asphalt, leaving behind a trail of blood, shattered vows, and a harrowing 911 emergency call echoing violently into the dark Idaho night. We build our lives like fortresses, trusting the vows we make and the people we invite into our inner circle. But what happens when the most dangerous threat is the one we willingly let through the front door? To understand the anatomy of a catastrophic betrayal, we must first examine the flawless masks worn in broad daylight. Emmett Corrigan was the golden boy of the local legal community, radiating an aura of untouchable success. He had meticulously constructed a reality that looked beautiful on paper. At only 30 years old, he commanded his own private law firm. His personal life appeared equally blessed. He had courted a beautiful woman named Ashley in a whirlwind romance. They dated for merely 2 months before he proposed, a rapid escalation that felt less like love and more like an acquisition of the perfect life partner. They sealed their vows in a sacred Mormon temple, projecting an image of absolute moral fortitude. By the time Ashley was 30, she was raising 5 young children, anchoring a bustling, joyful household while her husband chased greatness. Emmett thrived on this adulation. He weaponized his boyish charm, an overwhelming confidence to disarm anyone who dared question his motives. But beneath the polished veneer of a devoted patriarch and a brilliant attorney lurked a terrifying, bottomless hunger for more. Meanwhile, the Hall household presented a different, quieter type of illusion. Rob was the picture of unwavering stability. As a computer technician for the local sheriff's department, his life was heavily built on logic, highly predictable routines, and quiet devotion to his 2 teenage daughters. He blindly trusted his wife, completely offering her a safe, comfortable harbor after their somewhat chaotic relocation. But absolute safety often feels exactly like a suffocating cage to a restless spirit. Candace, actively grappling with the stinging humiliation of abruptly losing her previous paralegal job, felt her entire identity slipping away. She desperately craved validation. When she walked into Emmett's orbit, she was not just looking for employment. She was a deeply fractured ego stepping blindly into a beautiful disaster. The catalyst for destruction rarely arrives unannounced. It simmers in the quiet spaces between lies. For Candy and Emmett, the thrill of their illicit connection rapidly escalated from racy emails to late-night rendezvous. It became a toxic, open secret among their colleagues. At home, Emmett's pregnant wife, Ashley, felt the chilling distance growing between them. When she confronted him about his suspicious new paralegal, Emmett masterfully deflected. He leaned back, his tone dripping with condescending reassurance. "She is like a mother figure. She really believes in me." The manipulation was so profound that Candy even sent baby blankets to Ashley, wrapping the ultimate betrayal in soft pastel cotton. The tipping point arrived on a desperately manufactured evening. Ashley prepared a flawless dinner, dressing their 5 children in their absolute best clothes, begging silently for her husband to finally notice them. Instead, Emmett arrived late, refused to eat the cold food, and purposefully sparked a petty argument. He announced he was simply running to a local pharmacy to grab cold medicine, stepping out into the dark. Simultaneously, just a few miles away, Candy casually informed her trusting husband she was running a quick errand. The timeline converged sharply around 9 o'clock. Their vehicles met under the harsh fluorescent glow of the pharmacy parking lot. But instead of running innocent errands, they quickly slipped into Emmett's large truck, fueled up at a nearby gas station, and immediately retreated to a secluded subdivision to indulge their fatal lust away from prying eyes. When the flashing red and blue lights finally cut through the chaotic aftermath of that night, Candy found herself trembling intensely inside the suffocatingly small, windowless walls of a police interrogation room. Her initial statements were a desperate, meticulously constructed labyrinth of complete deceit. When the lead detective leaned forward, his voice dropping into a low, steady hum, and explicitly asked if she was romantically or sexually involved with her boss, Candy stared right back. Her voice barely wavered as she firmly replied, "No." She frantically wove a pathetic narrative, claiming she only met Emmett to pick up a prescription and vent about her own exhausting marital struggles. She admitted to lying to her teenage daughter over the phone that night, claiming she was just hanging out with her best friend Michelle. She aggressively portrayed Emmett not as a secret lover, but as a deeply sympathetic ear. Candy was desperately trying to control a rapidly unraveling narrative that had already violently slipped through her blood-stained fingers. But the fragile walls of her alibi were already crumbling under the immense, crushing weight of the cold, undeniable truth waiting outside in the dark. Every false syllable she uttered only tightened the invisible noose around her own neck, exposing a mind completely detached from reality. The physical evidence left behind at a crime scene is profoundly unforgiving. It does not lie, it does not manipulate, and it absolutely refuses to cover up for a fractured human ego. While Candy sat in the interrogation room spinning a frantic web of pathetic excuses, the crime scene analysts were meticulously cataloging the grim reality outside the local pharmacy. The harsh, unforgiving glare of the overhead parking lot lights illuminated a horrifying tableau of absolute destruction. Emmett lay lifeless on the freezing asphalt, his bright future violently extinguished by 2 massive gunshot wounds. One bullet had torn directly through his chest, while the other had struck his head with devastating, brutal precision. The sheer overkill indicated this was not a random robbery or a tragic accident. This was an intensely personal execution. A few feet away, Rob, Candy's seemingly dependable, deeply predictable husband, was also bleeding out from a severe grazing gunshot wound to his own head. The initial assumption seemed painfully obvious to any untrained observer. Two men had aggressively confronted each other in a dark parking lot over a woman, leading to a catastrophic exchange of gunfire. But criminals constantly underestimate the quiet, clinical patience of forensic science. If you were the lead investigator stepping into that chaotic, blood-soaked parking lot, would you catch the inconsistency here? The anomaly was hiding in plain sight, completely shattering Candy's carefully constructed narrative of a chance encounter gone horribly wrong. Look closely at the weapon. Investigators recovered a small, lethal, semi-automatic handgun from the scene. But the most glaring anomaly was not the weapon itself, but rather the bizarre, highly suspicious positioning of the evidence and the glaring gaps in Candy's own timeline. Candy had passionately claimed she and Emmett were merely talking in his truck, completely unaware of any looming danger. Yet, a silent, damning piece of evidence betrayed her every word. Rob's vehicle was parked dangerously close to Emmett's large truck, indicating he had forcefully boxed them in. Furthermore, the ballistic trajectory and the distribution of the shattered safety glass on the pavement told a totally different, incredibly sinister story. The glass was blown outward, meaning the first devastating shot was fired from inside the vehicle, not outside. This forensic reality directly contradicted Candy's frantic assertion that Rob simply walked up and started shooting wildly into the dark night. Why would the glass explode outward if the shooter was standing outside the door? The physical anomaly perfectly mirrored the psychological anomaly unfolding back at the station. Candy was not merely a traumatized witness caught in the terrible crossfire. She was the highly deceptive architect of the entire fatal collision, and the blood on her trembling hands told a terrible truth. Her mouth violently refused to ever speak aloud. The interrogation room is a meticulously designed psychological pressure cooker. It is a barren, windowless box meant to strip away the illusion of control and force the suspect to confront the suffocating weight of their own deceit. Candy sat at the cold metal table, her posture rigidly defensive, desperately clutching the frayed edges of her fabricated reality. The lead detective entered the room, his demeanor chillingly calm. He did not yell. He did not slam his hands against the table. Instead, he laid down a manila folder with a soft, heavy thud. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a smooth, surgical whisper. "We know about the affair, Candy." The color instantly drained from her face. The detective began pulling documents from the folder, spreading them across the table like a deadly tarot reading. First came the cell phone records, exposing hundreds of late-night texts and frantic calls. Next came the receipts, detailing the secret hotel rendezvous, and the undeniable proof of a toxic romance completely shattering her innocent paralegal facade. The rapid investigative pacing left her absolutely no room to breathe. She stammered, her voice cracking into a high, panicked pitch as she tried to backpedal. She admitted to a minor indiscretion, a fleeting moment of weakness, but the detective pushed harder, relentlessly dismantling her weak defenses. He forced her to walk through the exact timeline of the evening, minute by agonizing minute. Candy claimed she and Emmett were simply sitting in his truck in the pharmacy parking lot, innocently talking, when her husband suddenly appeared out of the dark. But how did Rob know where to find them? The detective revealed the fatal flaw in her story. Rob had grown deeply suspicious of her erratic behavior and constant absences. He had quietly accessed her phone records, tracking her digital footprint right to the secluded subdivision where she and Emmett had retreated. Rob had parked his vehicle, waiting in the suffocating silence of the night, watching his entire world crumble before his eyes. When Candy and Emmett finally emerged from their secret location and drove back to the pharmacy parking lot to retrieve her car, Rob followed them like a phantom. He forcefully drove his car directly in front of Emmett's heavy truck, boxing them in. The battle of wits in the interrogation room reached a fever pitch as the detective painted the horrifying picture. Rob had stepped out of his car holding a loaded handgun, his steady, predictable mind finally snapping under the unbearable weight of her ultimate betrayal. Candy wept quietly, but the seasoned detective saw right through the hollow performance. Her tears were not for the young father of 5 bleeding to death on the asphalt. They were only for herself. The psychological unraveling exposed a deeply pathological motive. Candy had manipulated 2 men. She weaponized Emmett's massive ego, an insatiable lust to fuel her own desperate need for validation, while simultaneously exploiting Rob's blind loyalty to maintain her comfortable suburban safety net. When Rob confronted them, the illusion violently shattered. Words were exchanged in the dark, heavy air. Then came the deafening roar of gunfire. Rob had fired directly into the truck, striking Emmett with brutal, lethal force before turning the weapon on himself, resulting in the grazing wound to his own head. Candy had orchestrated a deadly collision of fragile egos. She had sparked the fuse, walked away completely unscathed, and then sat in a brightly lit room aggressively playing the victim. The entire cat and mouse game was over. The absolute truth was staring her right in the face, completely stripped of its alibis, revealing a naked, devastating core of pure selfishness, boundless greed, and ultimate catastrophic destruction. When the gavel finally fell to open the trial, the courtroom became a theater for one of the most complex psychological defenses in modern legal history. Rob Hall was undeniably the man who pulled the trigger. The prosecution painted him as a cold, calculating executioner who hunted down his rival. But the defense presented a wildly different narrative, one that heavily shifted the ultimate blame away from the man holding the gun and squarely onto the toxic psychological warfare waged by his wife. The defense attorney stood before the jury, his voice trembling with practiced empathy. He argued that Rob was not a murderer, but rather a deeply broken man who had been violently pushed into a state of temporary madness. They painted Candy as a master manipulator who callously flaunted her infidelity, purposefully driving her devoted husband to the brink of total insanity. The defense passionately claimed that when Rob stepped out of his vehicle in that dark parking lot, he did not have murder in his heart. Instead, they argued he merely wanted to confront Emmett to demand the honest truth. According to this absurd narrative, it was Emmett and his towering ego, his arrogant refusal to back down, that triggered a sudden, blinding panic in Rob. The defense intensely insisted the gun went off in a chaotic haze of adrenaline and crushing heartbreak, presenting a tragic crime of intense passion rather than a coldly calculated execution. It was a bold, incredibly desperate attempt to turn the violent shooter into the ultimate helpless victim of a shattered suburban dream. If you were sitting on the jury, would you buy this explanation? Would you look at a man who meticulously tracked his wife in the dark of night, armed himself with a loaded weapon, boxed in a vehicle, fired 2 shots, and honestly believe he simply snapped? The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom sealed shut, trapping the thick, suffocating tension inside as the jury finally returned. The 12 men and women had meticulously weighed the blood-soaked evidence against the elaborate psychological theater of the defense. They refused to accept the fragile narrative of a temporary madness. When the foreman stood, the absolute silence in the room was deafening. Rob Hall was found guilty of second-degree murder. He had chosen to be the executioner in that dark parking lot. The judge leaned forward, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy as he delivered the crushing sentence. He firmly declared, "You took the law into your own hands, and in doing so, you destroyed 2 families forever." He sentenced Rob to serve 30 years behind the cold concrete walls of a state penitentiary, heavily insuring the once dependable suburban father would likely draw his last agonizing breath inside a steel cage. But true justice is rarely a simple equation. While Rob faced his grim reality, the true weight of the tragedy crushed the innocent. Souls left standing in the devastating aftermath. Ashley sat completely paralyzed in the gallery, clutching a damp, crumpled tissue. Her 5 young children were now permanently fatherless, forced to grow up in the immense, chilling shadow of a violent scandal. Emmett had made terrible, selfish choices, but his brutal execution robbed a family of their entire future. And then there was Candy. She walked out of the courthouse completely free of any heavy legal charges, having perfectly played her manipulative role until the bitter end. But she was eternally sentenced to a much darker prison. She must wake up every single morning of her miserable life looking intensely in the mirror, knowing forever that her toxic vanity ultimately painted the cold asphalt red with the blood of 2 ruined men. The devastating legacy of that cold Idaho night is a stark reminder of the fragile, deceptive nature of our carefully constructed realities. We must deeply honor the profound loss experienced by Ashley and her 5 innocent children. They are the true, lasting victims of this senseless violence, forced to navigate an entire lifetime completely devoid of a loving father. Their deeply tragic story serves as a chilling, necessary warning about the fatal behavioral red flags we often desperately choose to ignore. When extreme secrecy aggressively replaces open communication, and when flawed partners begin heavily gaslighting their loved ones. By brushing off illicit connections as professional mentorships, the fundamental foundation of trust is already fatally compromised. The psychological destruction born from a relentless, toxic hunger for external validation can quietly poison even the most beautiful, seemingly perfect homes. If you found yourself captivated by the dark, twisted psychology unraveling in this tragic case, please take a moment to subscribe, leave a thoughtful review, and share this episode with someone who is equally fascinated by the deeply hidden truths of human behavior. Your continued support directly allows us to keep dissecting these harrowing narratives. As we close this chapter, I want you to look closely at your own quiet, predictable surroundings. We constantly lock our heavy front doors every single night to keep the dangerous monsters out, completely convinced that the absolute greatest threats lurk deep in the shadowy alleys of the unknown. But the catastrophic collision of Rob, Candy, and Emmett proves a terrifying reality. The most lethal danger does not always violently break into your safe, peaceful suburban sanctuary. Sometimes it is already sitting comfortably at your dinner table, quietly sipping coffee, hiding a deadly secret behind a warm, incredibly familiar smile, making you wonder, who are you truly sleeping next to when the lights finally go out?